And finally, scientists are poring over the data from the Rosetta spacecraft's landing on a speeding comet out in space about a month ago. And already there's a hot debate about the origin of Earth's water. Our Kwon Soa explains the initial findings.
Where did the water on our planet Earth come from? That is one of the questions the Rosetta mission is trying to answer. After the European spacecraft's probe made a historic touchdown on comet 67P last month, now it's bringing us its first discoveries. One of it is the detection of water on the comet. That's no surprise. But a closer look at the results show that the water is very different from that on Earth. That's what's making scientists scratch their heads. Because so far they thought that comets that smashed into the Earth billions of years ago brought a bunch of water to the planet. But Rosetta's chemical analysis shows comet 67P's water has 3 times more deuterium, a form of hydrogen, than that of water on Earth. That, according to scientists, rules out that comets are the source of Earth's water. They say this makes it more likely that water came from asteroid collisions around 3.8 billion years ago, as asteroids' hydrogen is more similar in terms of their composition. But some say it's too early to eliminate the chances that comets dump the water into the Earth, saying the deuterium to hydrogen ratio varies by comet.
What we can conclude from these results is that water can develop from various different sources, either close to or far away from the sun.
The principal investigator of Rosetta, an instrument of the spacecraft, says the comet's high amount of deuterium means the water was formed at very low temperatures, meaning although it doesn't look like it's the water we have on Earth, it's a real treasure chest to explore very early times of our solar system. Kwon Soa, Arirang News.